Anyone unfamiliar with Java in 1996 should know that the language was slow as a week in prison, and therefore writing an operating system in its language would have been a terrible, terrible idea. Yet, that's what they did. Sun Microsystems designed their Java OS to run on network computers and embedded systems, but it was an absolute disaster and never took off commercially. Designed by Debian in 1999, Coral Linux was designed to wipe Microsoft's operating system monopoly off the face of the earth, but with high expectations come massive disappointments. Despite being graphically ahead of its time, the installer crashed more often than not, and once the OS was installed, it struggled to detect drives, rendering it nearly inoperable on a great many computers. Microsoft's first graphical user interface was certainly colorful, but no one who used it would have many other positive things to say about it. It was full of bugs, barely ran, and since applications were a dream of the future when it was released, nothing ran on it. Windows 1 was so delayed that by the time they released it, Microsoft were already marketing System 2.1, which was vastly superior, meaning that anyone who invested in Windows 1 had bought a real donkey. Not even Microsoft wanted anything to do with it. Despite being an important operating system in its heyday of the late 1960s, the ITS offered absolutely no security to its users. Anyone could log in into anyone else's active session and make alterations. It was eventually rendered obsolete by the rise of the much more advanced Unix, but ITS's massive security flaws allowed many of the earliest computer hackers to get their starts. GNU Hurd is the worst operating system you've never heard of, thanks in no small part to its failure to deliver, well, anything. After being announced in 1983 as a replacement for Unix, which would be made up of completely free software, GNU Hurd disappeared into the development wilderness and remains incomplete to this day. Despite releasing Windows 2000 just months before, Microsoft got caught up in Millennium Fever and released Windows Millennium Edition. With promises of improved performance and myriad graphical tweaks all designed to usher in the exciting new era, ME was nothing less than a complete disaster. It was slow, unstable, and only lasted a year before Microsoft ditched it entirely. It was so bad that it never even received a Surface Pack update. Make no mistake, for its time, MS-DOS was an incredible operating system, but in keeping with their need to reinvent the wheel and generally meddle with things which were working fine to begin with, Microsoft kept releasing updates to DOS, culminating in MS-DOS 4.0. In record time, people were reverting back to their old systems after programs crashed and their computers froze continuously, thanks to badly coded memory addresses. Although Symbian was developed way back in 1997, it wasn't until 2002 in the launch of the Nokia S60 that people began to take notice of it and its many inadequacies. Early versions of the firmware were riddled with bugs and errors, while the built-in web browser could barely load WAP-enabled web pages. Add to that the fact that software was often incompatible with later versions of the system. It's hardly surprising that Nokia made the move to Windows Phone OS as their profits started to dip. What is surprising is that it took them so long to make the change. Designed to bring together the user interface features of Windows with the open-source distribution of Linux, Lindows was an unmitigated nightmare. Despite Debian expecting many former Windows users to switch sides after the debacle of Windows ME, the cripplingly slow loading times on Lindows, coupled with the fact that more than 99% of applications were incompatible out of the box, meant that people were slow to take to it, and it ultimately failed. Although Microsoft eventually paid $20 million to buy the trademark, so it's not all that bad, I guess. Following on from the incredibly successful and actually rather good Windows XP was no small task, and it was one that Windows Vista royally screwed up. Instead of becoming more streamlined and building on what they had done right, Microsoft's new OS demanded absurd amounts of hard drive space and specifications which only around 10 to 15% of home computers at the time could actually stand up to. Windows Vista was widely touted as Microsoft's worst ever operating system. That was, until Windows 8 came out. Again showing that Microsoft rarely learned from their mistakes, they followed up the excellent Windows 7 with an operating system which runs Vista close for its title of worst OS ever. Obsessed with making a splash in the smartphone and tablet market, Microsoft Windows 8 was designed to be multifunctional and accommodate every device a user owned. However, its tile interface was unsuited to the majority of home computing, and Microsoft had done away with the desktop, which people had grown to love, including the Start button, meaning that there was a huge backlash against the company's vision of future home computing. They were forced to release Windows 8.1, which reinstated the desktop, but still gave users the option of using the cumbersome tiles.